And then we have Gauri, Gadgil, Project Coordinator for Environmental Impact Bonds with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where she leads work on a pilot project to introduce new financing tools to local governments for green infrastructure and stormwater management projects. And I will note that CBF is working with Hampton in our own region on an environmental impact bond now. So she brings some information about a local project as well.
Hello everyone, my name is Gauri Gadgil. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, so a nonprofit organization. And I am here to talk to you about a... Can you hear me now? All right, I will try to project. So for the last year and a half, we've been working on a pilot project to introduce environmental impact bonds, which are a new type of financing mechanism to local governments across the watershed to finance green infrastructure for stormwater management. So I will go through sort of what we've been doing for the last year and a half, but I thought I would start with a video to just go over what an EIB is, because I think it gives a nice explanation. Virtually every day somewhere in the watershed, rain falls on impervious surfaces like this, and it carries chemicals, plastics, fossil fuels, and damaging levels of nitrogen towards the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, the only major source of pollution that's still increasing in the bay is stormwater runoff. We want to work with municipalities to meet the goals of the Clean Water Act. So, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, with support from the Kresge Foundation, is introducing a revolutionary new way to finance green infrastructure. We're replacing traditional pipes and tunnels with rain gardens, bioswales, tree planting, pervious pavement, green roofs, and stream restorations. But even though green infrastructure is cost-effective, it takes money.
That money is typically raised through municipal bonds. But today there's a new type of investor and there's a new type of bond. We're in the middle of the largest wealth transfer in the history of the planet. These are the funds that baby boomers are passing down to their millennial and Gen Xer kids. These investors want two things. They want a financial return, and they want rigorously measured and evaluated social and environmental outcomes. Enter the Environmental Impact Bond. These bonds use a pay-for-success model, which rewards investors when communities are able to reach their measurable goals. We work with independent evaluators to set measurable goals for each and every project. With green infrastructure, the goal might be how many millions of gallons of stormwater can be kept from overflowing into local waterways. If the project meets its goals, municipalities pay investors the bond's set rate of return. If it underperforms, the municipality gets a risk share payment from the investor and now has the funds to try something else. If the project exceeds its goals, both parties win. The municipality saves money and the investor receives a higher rate of return. Pay for success. Quantified Ventures brokered the world's first environmental impact bond for the DC Water and Sewer Authority. The $25 million bond funded a green infrastructure project to manage stormwater runoff from 20 acres of impervious surfaces. Together with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we're working with these new investors who want to make an impact, and municipalities who are attempting to solve a very serious environmental problem.
Baltimore City will be installing over 100 green infrastructure projects to manage and treat stormwater. Green infrastructure provides both environmental and social benefits like cooler neighborhoods, more walkable streets, improving air quality, and increased property value. Many of these projects are located in underserved neighborhoods and in dense row house neighborhoods lacking green space.
Stormwater management is an expensive proposition for most local governments around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. CBF wants to help them find the financing necessary to do this kind of management, and particularly we're interested in green infrastructure. A lot of local governments feel that this kind of proposition is a little risky, that the performance of that green infrastructure is not known yet. Sharing the risk with an investor is a way for them to produce these practices on the ground. CBF has always been an innovator, and we hope that this kind of an instrument can be useful across the Bay watershed for all kinds of local governments, so that they can get a handle on their stormwater problems and also achieve some other benefits along the way. Bottom line, we're interested in saving the Bay. We think the environmental impact bond is a useful tool, and we want to try to prove it here.
Environmental impact bonds are a huge win-win for everybody and a home run for the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, great. So that was just an overview of the project that we've been running. And just to reiterate from the video, so CBF is interested in saving the Bay and reducing pollution into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Stormwater flowing from urban and suburban areas is one of the only growing sources of nitrogen pollution into the Bay. And so we are trying to figure out ways to make that to address that problem in a way that is cost effective for local governments. We know it's expensive. We saw the DC water model happen a couple of years ago, and I'll talk about it a bit more and thought, is this something that we can introduce to other governments? And so we are actually working on 2 projects currently, and I'll get to that. I think everyone in this room is probably familiar already with green infrastructure and the types of infrastructure we're asking cities to put to invest more in. Just quickly, the way the EIB works again is investors provide upfront capital to local governments through a bond issuance. The local governments install green infrastructure to manage their stormwater. And we work with the local government to figure out a predetermined outcome metric or performance metric, something that they want to achieve with this infrastructure that is driven by local priorities and goals. An independent evaluator is brought in once that infrastructure is installed to determine, did the infrastructure meet the objectives that were predetermined, and if the performance is assessed to, if the infrastructure performs as predicted, then the municipality repays that bond like a normal municipal bond. If the infrastructure underperforms, there's a clawback or risk share payment given back to the municipality so that they have something to try a new idea. And if the infrastructure overperforms, there's a bonus payment paid out to investors. I will say the probability of the performance, it's structured so that I think 95% of the time the infrastructure should be performing as expected. So it's really on the tail end of, high performance or underperformance is really on either tail. And then the municipal government will repay the bond accordingly. This is based on a bond that was issued by DC Water, and they had plans to install 3 large stormwater tunnels, very expensive tunnels, and they thought that they could get away with replacing one of those tunnels with a large deployment of green infrastructure. But they weren't sure if that deployment would actually be able to manage the volume of stormwater that they wanted to retain. And so they instead used an environmental impact bond to finance a pilot project. So I believe it was, maybe it says 20 acres of 365 total acres of green infrastructure. And they set it up so that if the pilot 20 acres is able to handle the volume they expect, they repay like a bond with their interest rate of about 3%. If it underperforms for some reason, and the green infrastructure cannot hold that volume, then investors will repay DC Water $3.3 million as a risk share payment. And if they overperform, DC Water will pay investors a $3.3 bonus payment. And that sort of the overperformance piece also means that, you know, they've realized that their green infrastructure can actually handle a lot more stormwater volume than they were expecting, and they probably don't need to do that whole 365-acre deployment. They can reduce that, and so there's some cost savings there that the performance payment would come out of. So that is the one model that we had to work with. CBF saw this and thought, you know, can we work with other governments to set up something similar, and is there an appetite? So we're working with that group, Quantified Ventures. We went to municipalities across the watershed, and we have currently 2 active projects, one with the city of Baltimore and the other with the city of Hampton. So our project in Baltimore is further along. We've been working with them for about a year, and worked with them to identify about 120 small and medium scale GI projects that they have scattered all over the city. They're all on public lands, on school sites, in public right-of-ways, a couple of stream restorations, and they are looking to issue an EIB of about $6.2 million, and that will be alongside other funding that the city has for this portfolio of projects. So they've taken out SRF funds. They have other funds identified to pay for these projects, which I think in total come to somewhere around $15 million. The performance metric that they have settled on is really interesting. So they are looking to measure plant survival on the actual green infrastructure practices because that affects their ongoing operations and maintenance costs. And the city of Baltimore has plans to do a lot more green infrastructure installation, and O&M costs are a worry of theirs. So they figure if they can, with this deployment, understand more about what plant mix works best, how to educate the community around, you know, not walking through their planters and whatnot, and have those plants stay viable, that'll help reduce those costs going forward. We are close to, I hope, a bond issuance. So we're working with the city to get to the point of the bond issuance, and after that point, you know, it would be on the city to sort of take these projects forward. Our work in Hampton is relatively newer, so we started working there back in October. Many in this room will be familiar with Hampton's climate change resiliency plan. So they participated in the Dutch dialogues, and out of that work, they've spent, I think, the last 2 years developing a resilient Hampton plan to really think about how to plan for climate change and address localized flooding and nuisance flooding and all the rest. And so when we came in, they thought that the EIB could be a great tool to finance some of the pilot projects coming out of their Resilient Hampton plan, and that's what we're working with them now to do. So we are in still pretty early stages of this project, but we are working closely with the city's government to talk through which of the potential pilot projects might be a good fit for this model. And once those projects that portfolio of projects is identified, we'll also start discussions with them about what would be an appropriate performance metric to use with this model as well. What else? All right. So we have 2 active projects, one in Baltimore, one in Hampton, but we approached a lot of cities across the watershed to work with us on this project. We had funding to work with possibly 3 or 4, and we ended with 2. And there was we got a lot of feedback from different municipal governments about why they might be interested, but not at this time. They wanted to see a couple of other bonds issued and see how it played out. But there were a couple of lessons that we learned that we thought were worth sharing, because there's a lot of different groups looking at how to bring financing, obviously, to various issues associated with resilience and climate change planning. So first, we have the regulatory environment here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We thought there would be a really strong regulatory incentive for local governments to work with us, because they have to meet stormwater requirements under their stormwater permits. And actually, it turns out that because of the way that that model is set up and that permit is written, local governments get credit for installing stormwater practices, whether or not they're performing well or not so well. And so that quickly took out that performance incentive that should have driven a lot of this work. And so you'll notice with our Baltimore and Hampton projects, sort of the interest of the city is not directly linked to stormwater management, but it's some sort of tangential piece that they can measure. So in the case of Baltimore, it's O&M costs and plant survival. With Hampton, they're interested in their sort of climate change plan and reducing localized flooding. So I imagine that the ultimate performance metric we settle on will be related to that piece. Second, municipal capacity. A lot of the local governments that we're working with in the watershed are smaller. And this bond issuance required, or we were told by our partners, required at least a $2 to $3 million minimum. A lot of the cities aren't currently using financing for stormwater projects specifically. They budget it out of their annual budgets, and so we think that those costs and needs will grow going into the future, but people aren't quite ready to be doing that yet. And so for the time being, we can just sort of create models, set up, introduce tools, and hopefully going forward, people will find them more helpful. Planning and budgeting. And so we came into this project with the assumption that EIBs could fill a financing gap for shovel-ready projects, but obviously city governments are planning projects and planning financing sort of hand in hand. And so we, especially with our work in Hampton, sort of took a step back and approached the city at an earlier stage of planning so that we could really get involved in their CIP process, in their budgeting process, and that this sort of lesson highlighted for us the need for a project pipeline and having projects engaging with local governments at an earlier stage of planning. And then, so just to summarize here, we weren't sure what to expect with the EIB project. We were hoping it would be a useful tool, and we've learned that it is a good tool for piloting new ideas that might have some sort of risk associated with them. So it's a risk transfer mechanism, but they're just one of many tools that a local government can use. They work well when there's been groundwork done by city governments around resiliency planning, green infrastructure planning, so that there's something to build off of rather than starting from scratch. We as an organization will continue to look for and support mechanisms that local governments can use to plan and prepare. All right, thank you.